How you doing? It's Global Politics with Jim Martin. Today I wanted to talk about something that I noticed the other day. It's called tit for tat or reciprocal strategies. What brought it to my mind was I saw an interview with the Indian ambassador to the United States last week in which he described how the terrorist attack that happened in Indian-controlled Kashmir was seen as the catalyst for them to strike back. That makes a lot of sense to a lot of people, right? But what he then said was, so we have conducted these airstrikes and we consider the matter closed. So an eye for an eye, so to speak. And that is the essence of what tit for tat is about. Now, we know in this circumstance that Pakistan then struck back again, but in a much more limited way, and therefore the conflict was then resolved and it's over with. That kind of approach where you've done something, so I'm going to do something back, or alternatively, if an adversary makes a conciliatory move or a beneficial move towards the other party, and then that party responds in kind, that is also a form of reciprocity or tit for tat strategies. Now, where did these come from? We got to take a big step back because the way that countries used to calculate their decision making in these matters often revolved around calculations of national power. Let's count up all the things they have and the stuff they can do, the size of their economy and all these kinds of things, and make these calculations as to whether or not we can defeat them in an armed conflict. How good was your intelligence? How good were your estimates? All these sorts of things. And they would make these sort of estimations and therefore calculate, well, the United States should be able to easily defeat North Vietnam and any forces associated with it. We all know how that turned out. Not so great. When did this reciprocal strategy stuff start to come in? John Nash, who perhaps we might know from seeing the movie A Beautiful Mind, really originated the idea about game theory. And this is about individuals making calculations based on the utility or probability of the outcome. So if I believe that I can achieve a particularly positive outcome, if I'm going to go in and ask for a raise at work, for instance, and I believe that I've got the right case for that and the probability of getting that raise is pretty high, I may choose to do that. Perhaps I might see it the other way and believe, the odds of me getting that raise are pretty low, so I'm probably not going to do that. Furthermore, game theory expands outward to suggest if I were to go and ask for a raise and there were no consequence to me asking for that raise, then why wouldn't I take the chance anyway, right? Well, what if my boss isn't really pleased with my performance and that act of me asking for a raise denigrates that possibility from happening in the future, or even worse, could lead to me having a confrontation with my boss and getting fired. Those kinds of calculations also play into game theory as that practice evolved over time. In the beginning, it was just kind of really controlled games about somebody makes a decision to do something with the likelihood of some outcome. The shadow of the future, so to speak, and that's like a technical term they use, was not considered in those kinds of decisions. Now, as it continued to evolve, you see ideas ramping up and spreading out. Now, one of the things that is so common in science is that some really nerdy math people or really nerdy whatever sort of science people you want to talk about develop some sort of idea or process or something purely for intellectual purposes most often. Sometimes they have some sort of applied idea, but really it's the intrigue and the fascination of developing these sorts of models that motivates intellectuals to do this. So perhaps they come up with some of this stuff and they're like, this is really cool. I'm going to publish this paper. Great. And then other people outside of that world, especially outside of math world, get a hold of this and may be able to translate in their heads like, wow, hey, this is a potentially useful tool for me to use over here. They're not wrong, but in many cases, they fundamentally misunderstand the application of it. And perhaps they even bring the person in and they talk to them about it. And they're like, yep, but I really want to do this with it and I'll outsmart my competitors, or I can really achieve these great goals if I use this tool, this framework, this approach in my strategies or negotiations or whatever it happens to be. And the problem with that is it's aggregating that stuff up to these different levels that creates problems. When you look at very simple game theory like there was in the beginning, it's not so straightforward to aggregate that up to a whole bunch of people, have a whole bunch of different preferences perhaps. When you start thinking of, okay, here's two countries that have leaders, political leaders, military folks, economic people, diplomatic intelligence people who are all have a variety of motivations for what they're doing, and all are making, even if it's unconscious, making these sorts of utility calculations on their own, you can see how it gets a lot more complicated. And that is why, these sorts of things don't turn out. And in the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s a little bit, you had people who were what were called positivists, who were essentially looking at the world as a deterministic sort of thing, where if we apply these sorts of pressures, this is the outcome that we're almost certainly going to get, barring some crazy thing. And then they would find that, well, maybe they got part of that outcome, but not really. And sometimes they were wildly wrong. One of the other problems with this sort of taking a mathematical model from math world and nerd world and applying it in real world is that oftentimes these things make perfect information assumptions. What is that? That means that everybody understands what their role is in this interaction, this negotiation, this conflict, whatever it happens to be. And that is often not the case. When you think about, for instance, Vladimir Putin is a perfect example. Vladimir Putin is a dictator who, over the course of many years, has created a cadre of people around him who are going to tell him what he wants to hear in almost all circumstances. If you ever tell him something he doesn't want to hear, boy, you are making a risky calculation. Yeah, the guy who ended up trying to lead some sort of rebellion and then ended up getting blown up in an airplane. These sorts of things in that world are very serious consequences. Yet, my larger point is that he surrounded himself with these people that almost certainly thought the same way that he does about things like Ukraine and NATO and other calculations, and thus believed that they could defeat Ukraine in a matter of a few days. Now, again, we know they almost did, but they didn't. They couldn't quite pull it off because the real world intervened, and those pesky Ukrainians just weren't going to put up with that. And they were like, no, thank you. We're going to keep our country. Thank you very much. That didn't factor in to the darkest nightmares of what the Russian military establishment, and more importantly, the very close-knit cadre around Putin believed. We do see this in democracies at times, but it's more rare because we live in a free society. People feel quite free to mouth off all the time, and cabinet secretaries mouth off. They resign, they pitch fits, they go to the press, they do all this stuff. And so things get out, and that information, as uncomfortable as it may be in some circumstances, comes back through. We can see this with looking at the second Gulf War, weapons of mass destruction. These kinds of calculations were almost certainly made prior to this, of probabilities of these likelihoods of these things being in these different places and trustworthiness of the intelligence. And in the end, they ended up creating this groupthink mentality within that decision-making circle, and they didn't pay attention to anything else. And they even threw some people in jail. So that perfect information assumption doesn't hold up in the real world. Deterrence strategies are another thing that, honestly, I've heard a lot of people talk about deterrence, and I at a core level, I think it works. Of the biggest tests that we have seen, where we look at things like the entire Cold War and the nuclear arms race, and things like the Cuban Missile Crisis and other close calls with nuclear arms, it seems to have held out. That said, there are lots of situations in which deterrence does not appear to have worked. What are these nerds good for? What do these scientists know? Because they're making a model, much like we build a model airplane, and we might even be able to put like functional engines in it and remote control it and do all the cool stuff with it. It's not going to act like the actual airplane that we have sitting on the runway. So these models are always going to be imperfect. And that's why we've moved into what's called a post-positivist world in terms of our application of these models in real world. Still, people want the world to be deterministic. They want it to be positivist, but it's not. And this is what's frustrating about things like deterrence, tit for tat, reciprocal strategies, all these kinds of things. When we actually involve multiple groups of people operating with varying priorities, not always in line with one another, and we're expecting two countries to resolve something, it's often just not going to happen. In this last case, India and Pakistan, it appears that both sides were able to have somewhat better information about the intentions and the armaments arrayed against them from the other side and the options that they had, and they were able to back down. It worked out in this case. There are two normative outcomes from these sorts of strategies when you map them out and game them out. And one of them is that if someone attacks you, the best thing to do is munificently provide back something, and that often solves it. The other one is that reciprocal attacks, often in an accelerating way, just continue down the line into infinity until you reach some different stage of conflict that's much greater and much more costly. That said, real world applications, we live in a world, we look out into it, we see what's going on. We have intelligence agencies, we have security forces, we have militaries, as do all of our adversaries, including our non-state adversaries. And they make calculations based on the things that provide utility and value to them, and they make calculations about what they do based on the cost or benefit of what it might provide. And perfect information just does not exist. So I hope that's interesting to you. It's a little bit wonky, but these are things that percolate out through these spheres from an academic perspective into an applied security sort of field. There are people who know a lot more about this than I do, but I've studied a fair amount. So if you have some kind of context that's different or a different approach that you'd like to share in the comments, please feel free to do so. I look forward to seeing you again on the next one, and have a great day. Thanks.